The Montana wilderness in December was a cathedral of silence. Snow-laven pines stood as frozen sentinels against a sky the color of brushed steel, and the only sound was the whisper of wind threading through the valleys of the Bitterroot Range. For Navy SEAL Mason Cole, this emptiness was a balm, a counterweight to the chaos that had defined the last 15 years of his life. He stood on the porch of his rented cabin, a mug of black coffee steaming in his calloused hands, the ceramic warm against skin that bore the scars of a dozen deployments. At 36, Mason was a man carved from hard experience, 6'1", broad-shouldered, with close-cropped dark hair, graying at the temples, and eyes the color of weathered stone that held the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much. The sharp planes of his face were softened only by the beginnings of a beard, salted with white, and his movements carried the economy of a man who never wasted energy. The beard was new. In the field, he'd always been clean-shaven, mission requirements, tactical necessity. But out here, in the profound isolation of the Bitterroot Range, there were no mission requirements. Just the slow, deliberate process of remembering what it felt like to be something other than a weapon. Beside him, lying on the weathered planks of the porch, was Havoc. Havoc was a Belgian Malinois, 80 pounds of muscle, intelligence, and unwavering loyalty forged in the crucible of combat. His tan coat was scarred in places, a puckered line along his left flank from shrapnel in Fallujah, a notch missing from his right ear courtesy of a Taliban fighter who'd gotten too close. His dark muzzle was flecked with gray, and at 9 years old he was technically retired from active duty. But his amber eyes were still sharp, still scanning the tree line, still protecting. Mason reached down, his hand finding the familiar warmth of Havoc's head. The dog leaned into the touch, a low contented rumble vibrating in his chest. It was a sound Mason had heard in the back of helicopters, in forward operating bases, in the tense silence before a breach. It meant safety. It meant home. "We earned this, buddy," Mason murmured, his voice rough from disuse. Out here, there was no one to talk to but the dog and the mountains. 30 days. No ops, no briefings, no war. The cabin was deliberately remote, 40 miles from the nearest town of Timber Falls, accessible only by a rutted logging road that was now buried under 2 feet of fresh powder. The structure itself was solid, built by someone who understood the unforgiving nature of Montana winters. Thick log walls, a stone chimney, triple-pane windows that held back the cold. Inside, a wood stove radiated a deep, penetrating warmth, and the shelves held a stack of paperback thrillers Mason would probably never read. No cell service, no internet, just the crackle of burning pine, the weight of silence, and the profound, healing quiet of a world at peace. For 2 weeks, it had worked. The nightmares had softened, not disappeared, but their edges had blurred. The hyper-vigilance that made him check exits and assess threats in every room, that made him scan rooftops and parked cars and strangers' hands, had begun to fade. Out here, there were no threats, just the mountains, the snow, and the bond between a warrior and his dog. He had come to understand something in these 2 weeks. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of the sound of his own breathing, of Havoc's steady heartbeat, of wind moving through 10,000 acres of pine. It was the sound of not dying, of not killing, of simply being. The sky was darkening now, the pale afternoon light surrendering to the iron gray of an approaching storm. Mason could smell it on the wind, that sharp metallic scent that promised heavy snow. The Weather Service, in its last broadcast before he'd lost signal, had called it a major winter event. Meteorological speak for a blizzard that would bury the high country under 3 feet of powder and make the roads impassable for days. Out here, that didn't mean isolation. It meant freedom. He didn't mind. That was the point. Mason took a long drink of his coffee, feeling the bitter heat slide down his throat. He watched a raven take flight from a distant pine, its black wings stark against the gray sky. He thought about the men on his team, Lopez, who was home in San Diego with his wife and newborn daughter. Chen, who was already back in training for the next rotation. Ramirez, who'd taken leave to hike the Appalachian Trail and find himself, whatever that meant. They'd all scattered to their corners of the world, seeking their own versions of peace. Mason had chosen the mountains. Havoc had chosen to follow. The first snowflakes began to fall fat, lazy flakes that drifted down like ash. Within minutes, they were coming faster, thicker, a curtain of white descending over the forest. "Storm's here," Mason said to Havoc. "Let's get inside." The dog stood, stretched, and followed his handler into the warm sanctuary of the cabin. Mason closed the door, threw the bolt, and added another log to the fire. The flames leaped up, hungry and bright. He settled into the worn leather armchair that had become his command post for the past 2 weeks. Havoc took his position on the rug by the hearth, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed. For a long moment, Mason just sat, listening to the storm build outside, feeling the warmth of the fire, watching his dog breathe. This, he thought, was what peace felt like. He didn't know that in less than 6 hours, that peace would shatter. He didn't know that the war he'd tried to escape had already found its way to his door. And he didn't know that a dying dog was crawling through miles of frozen wilderness, carrying with it the only hope for a child's survival. 60 miles to the east, in the small town of Timber Falls, Montana, 8-year-old Emma Hartley sat at her kitchen table, carefully coloring a picture of a reindeer. Her tongue stuck out slightly in concentration, the way children do when they're focused on something important, and her small hand guided a red crayon with deliberate, careful precision. Emma was a bright-eyed child with a cascade of honey-brown curls that refused to be tamed, framing a face dusted with freckles, and dominated by large hazel eyes that held the kind of innocent wonder the world hadn't yet stolen. She wore a faded purple sweatshirt 2 sizes too big, a hand-me-down from her older cousin Mija, and mismatched socks, one with snowflakes and one with dinosaurs. Her world was small but full. Her mother Sarah, their modest rental house on the edge of town, her second-grade classroom, where she excelled at reading, and her beloved tabby cat, Mr. Whiskers, who was currently napping on the windowsill. The reindeer she was coloring was for her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, who had asked the class to draw their favorite Christmas animal. Emma had chosen Rudolph because she liked the idea that being different, having a glowing red nose, could make you special instead of weird. "Almost done, sweetie?" Sarah Hartley called from the kitchen, her voice warm but tired. She was standing at the sink, washing dishes from dinner, her hands red and chapped from the harsh soap and cold water. The hot water heater had been acting up again, and calling a repairman cost money they didn't have. "Just finishing his nose, Mama." Emma called back, her voice bright with the unself-conscious happiness of a child who doesn't yet understand how hard her mother works to keep that happiness alive. Sarah smiled, drying her hands on a dish towel that had seen better days. She was a woman in her early 30s, who looked older, the kind of aging that comes from worry and exhaustion, not years. Her hair, the same honey brown as Emma's, was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her clothes were the uniform of someone who worked 2 jobs. Black pants and a simple shirt that could transition from her morning shift at the diner to her evening shift at the grocery store. Life was hard, but she was determined to give Emma everything she could. Every toy Emma had received for her birthday had come from the thrift store, carefully selected and wrapped with love. Every meal was planned down to the penny, stretching a pound of ground beef and a box of pasta into 3 days of dinners. But Emma never went to bed hungry, never went to school in dirty clothes, never felt anything but loved. That was what mattered. Sarah glanced at the clock. 4:47 de la tarde. The storm everyone had been talking about was supposed to hit tonight. She'd already called both her jobs and told them she wouldn't be coming in until it passed. The house wasn't much drafty, with thin walls and windows that rattled when the wind blew, but it was warm enough, and they had food. They would be fine. She walked into Deverant, the living room, and looked over Emma's shoulder. The reindeer was actually quite good. Emma had a gift for art, a talent. Sarah encouraged even though art supplies were expensive. The red nose was collared in bright and bold, standing out against the brown body. "It's beautiful, baby. Mrs. Patterson is going to love it." Emma beamed. "You think so?" "I know so." There was a knock at the door. Sarah frowned. It was late afternoon, and the light was already fading. The storm everyone had been talking about was supposed to hit tonight. She wasn't expecting anyone. The few friends she had knew better than to drop by unannounced, and the landlord had already collected rent for the month. Through the frosted glass pane, she could make out a figure, a man in a heavy coat, his face obscured by shadow and the growing darkness. "Stay at the table, baby," she said to Emma, wiping her hands on her jeans and moving toward the door. Something about the knock, its sharp, impatient rhythm, made her uneasy. She opened it a crack, the security chain still engaged. It was a flimsy thing, installed by a previous tenant, but it gave her a small measure of comfort. The man smiled. He was in his 40s, average height, with a clean-shaven face and the kind of ordinary features that would be easy to forget: brown hair, brown eyes, a face that blended into any crowd. He wore a thick winter jacket with a company logo stitched on the chest and held a clipboard in his gloved hands. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice polite, almost bored, the tone of someone doing a routine job they'd done 1,000 times before. "I'm with Mountain Gas and Electric. We've had reports of a potential gas leak in this neighborhood. I need to check your meter. It'll just take a minute." Sarah hesitated. She hadn't heard anything about a gas leak. Wouldn't they have called? Wouldn't there have been notices? But the man looked official. The clipboard, the logo, the professional demeanor. And if there really was a gas leak, that was dangerous. That was life-threatening. "Can I see some ID?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "Of course, ma'am." He reached into his jacket with his free hand, his movements casual, unhurried. "Just give me a second here." What he pulled out wasn't a badge. It was a cloth, white, damp, and reeking of a sharp chemical smell that hit Sarah's senses a half-second before her brain could process what was happening. His other hand shot through the crack in the door, impossibly fast, and clamped the cloth over her nose and mouth. Sarah tried to scream, tried to pull back, but his grip was iron-strong, professional. The chain snapped with a metallic ping. The door flew open. Sarah's world tilted, blurred. Her legs gave out. She heard Emma scream a high, terrified sound that would haunt her in the darkness to come. And then there was nothing but falling, and the cold and the suffocating sweetness of chloroform dragging her down into the black. The man's name was Victor Reese, though he'd used a dozen names over the years: Michael Sanders, James Kellner, David Frost. Names were tools, easily discarded when they became liabilities. At 43, Victor was a predator by profession and choice. He had been a long-haul trucker once, moving goods across state lines, until he realized that certain kinds of goods, the kind that didn't appear on manifests, the kind that cried and begged, were far more lucrative than furniture and electronics. He specialized in acquisition and transport. He found the merchandise, secured it, and delivered it to buyers who paid in cryptocurrency and asked no questions. He'd been doing it for 6 years, and he'd never been caught. He was careful. He was methodical. And he understood something fundamental. Law enforcement was only effective if you gave them something to notice. Single mothers, isolated houses, children no one was looking for, these were invisible targets. And when the merchandise vanished in the middle of a blizzard, even the possibility of investigation vanished with it. He wasn't alone. As Sarah's body went limp from the chloroform-soaked rag, a second figure emerged from the shadows beside the porch, a wiry man named Kade, 10 years younger, with cold eyes and the jittery energy of someone who enjoyed his work too much. Kade had a thin, rat-like face, a neck tattoo that looked like it had been done in prison, and hands that were never still. "Grab the kid," Victor hissed, catching Sarah's unconscious form and dragging her inside. His voice was low, controlled, efficient. "And keep her quiet." Kade moved fast. He had done this before, not often, but enough to know the procedure. Emma, hearing the commotion, had stood from her table, her eyes wide with confusion and terror. The red crayon fell from her hand, rolling across the floor. "Mama?" Her voice was small, uncertain. A child's voice calling for the one person who could make sense of a world that had suddenly stopped. Making sense. Kade was on her in seconds. He clamped a gloved hand over her mouth, lifting her small body off the ground with ease. She kicked and thrashed, her small fists pounding uselessly against his arm, her screams muffled into silence. "Shut up," he snarled, his breath hot and sour against her ear, smelling of cigarettes and something metallic. "Make a sound, and I hurt your mom. Understand?" Emma's eyes, those wide hazel eyes, filled with tears, but she stopped struggling. The man's grip was iron, and the threat was clear. She nodded once, her body going rigid with terror. Kade grinned. "Good girl." Victor surveyed the small, shabby house with professional detachment. He noted the details: the threadbare couch, the thrift store furniture, the drawings taped to the refrigerator with dollar store magnets. Single mother, barely scraping by. No family support network, working multiple jobs. Perfect. The house smelled like cheap spaghetti sauce and cinnamon air freshener trying to cover the smell of mildew. There was a space heater in the corner, duct taped together, and a stack of unpaid bills on the counter. This was easy. Too easy. Single mother, isolated house. No neighbors close enough to hear. The nearest occupied home was a quarter-mile down the road, and that belonged to Old Man Garrett, who was half-deaf and kept to himself. The storm would cover their tracks. By the time anyone noticed Sarah and her daughter were missing, they'd be 3 states away. "Tie the mom up in the bedroom," Victor ordered, his voice flat, businesslike. "We'll take the girl to the cash house until the road's clear. Buyers flying in from Seattle day after tomorrow." Kade grinned, his teeth yellow in the dim light. "She's a cute one. Premium price." Victor shot him a warning look, sharp, cold. "She's merchandise, not a toy. Don't damage her." Kade's grin faltered, but the hunger in his eyes didn't dim. Yeah, I got it." They worked quickly, efficiently. Victor dragged Sarah into the small bedroom, her body limp and unresisting. He used zip ties from his coat pocket, industrial grade, the kind that wouldn't break, and secured her wrists behind her back, then her ankles. He gagged her with a dish towel from the kitchen, tying it tight enough to muffle any sound but not tight enough to suffocate her. He wasn't a sadist. He just needed her out of the way long enough for the transaction to complete. Emma, meanwhile, was being wrapped in a blanket by Kade, not out of kindness, but to keep her from freezing in the truck. Dead merchandise had no value. As Kade carried her toward the door, Emma caught a glimpse of the kitchen table. Her reindeer drawing was still there, the red nose bright and cheerful, mocking the nightmare unfolding around her. She tried to memorize it, the warmth of the kitchen, the smell of home, the sound of her mother's voice calling her "sweetie." She tried to hold on to it because some part of her, the part that understood more than a child should, knew she might never see it again. The last thing Emma saw, as Kade shoved her into the back of a dark panel van, was her home, warm and safe and impossibly distant, disappearing into the swirling snow. The van's door slammed shut with a hollow metallic thud. There was only darkness, and the smell of rust and fear. Outside, in the yard, something moved. A German shepherd, 90 pounds of trained muscle and loyalty, emerged from the neighbor's property. His name was Max, and he belonged to Old Man Garrett. Max was a retired police convict, 11 years old, with a scared muzzle and eyes that had seen violence before. He had been trained to protect. It was in his DNA, his training, his very soul. And he had heard Emma scream. Max charged. He hit Kade just as the man was closing the van's rear door, slamming into him with the full force of his body. Kade went down hard, cursing, and Max's jaws found his arm, biting down with controlled aggression, not to kill, but to disable. Victor Spoon, his hand reaching for the pistol tucked in his waistband. "Get him off." Kade kicked at the dog, trying to dislodge him, But Max's grip was unshakable. Blood soaked through Kade's jacket sleeve. Victor didn't hesitate. He pulled the pistol, aimed, and fired. The shot was deafening in the quiet neighborhood. Max yelped a sound of pain and shock and released his grip. The bullet had grazed his flank, tearing through fur and flesh. He stumbled, his back leg buckling. "Stupid animal," Victor spat. He aimed again, this time for the kill. But Max was already moving. Despite the pain, despite the blood, he ran not away, but toward the forest, toward the mountains, toward the place where Old Man Garrett had once told him help lived. He ran because that was what Cuevas did. They completed the mission, and his mission was to save Emma. CTA numero uno. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in Trafficked Dyke, the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Victor watched the dog disappear into the darkness, blood trail marking his path. "Should we go after it?" Kade asked, clutching his bleeding arm. "No. It's shot, it's old, and there's a blizzard coming. It'll be dead in an hour." Victor holstered his weapon. "Let's move." They loaded Emma into the van, locked the door, and drove away into the storm. Behind them, Sarah Hartley lay unconscious in her bedroom, bound and gagged. And in the forest, Max ran. His side screamed with pain. His leg was going numb. But he ran. Because somewhere in the mountains, there was a man, a soldier, someone who could help. Max had smelled him days ago on one of his patrols through the forest. The scent of gunpowder and tactical gear and discipline. He didn't know the man's name, but he knew what the man was, a warrior. And warriors saved people. Max ran until his legs gave out. He crawled when he couldn't run. He dragged himself through the snow, inch by agonizing inch. The child's backpack grabbed from the van in his final attack, clutched in his jaws. He would reach the warrior, or he would die trying. The Kade house was a nightmare dressed as a cabin. It sat 15 miles outside Timber Falls, deep in the forest on an abandoned logging access road that hadn't been maintained in a decade. The structure was old, built in the 1972 by a timber company, and long since forgotten. Its windows were boarded with rotting plywood, its roof sagged under years of accumulated snow and neglect, and its siding was peeling away in long gray strips. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew, motor oil, and something darker. The residue of fear and desperation left by others who had passed through this place and never come home. Victor had used the Kade house for 3 years. It was perfect, remote enough to avoid detection, solid enough to withstand the elements, and positioned along a route that connected logging roads to a private airfield 30 miles north. Buyers flew in, merchandise was transferred, and everyone disappeared before anyone could notice. It was a ghost operation. Clean, professional. Kade dragged Emma inside, her small body still wrapped in the blanket. She was shaking not from the cold, but from a terror so complete it had stolen her voice. She hadn't spoken since the van. She hadn't cried. She had simply frozen, her mind unable to process what was happening. "Put her in the back room," Victor ordered, shaking snow from his coat. He lit a camping lantern, the harsh white lead light throwing grotesque shadows on the walls. The main room was sparse: a folding table, a few camp chairs, a portable heater that barely worked, and a stack of zip ties and duct tape in the corner. This was a processing center, not a home. Back room was generous. It was little more than a storage closet, maybe 8 feet by 6 feet, with a concrete floor, a single dirty mattress, and a radiator pipe running along the wall. The pipe was rusted, immovable, perfect for securing prisoners. Kade shoved Emma inside and pulled the blanket away. She stumbled, catching herself on the wall. She was still wearing her purple sweatshirt and mismatched socks. She looked impossibly small in the bare, cold room. "Sit," Kade ordered, pointing at the mattress. Emma sat, her movements mechanical, her eyes unfocused. Kade zip-tied her wrists together, then secured the tie to the radiator pipe. The plastic bit into her skin, already leaving red marks. Please, Emma finally whispered, her voice a broken thread. I want my mama. Kade crouched in front of her, his smile a cruel thing. His face was close enough that she could see the blackheads on his nose, the yellow tint of his teeth, the cold emptiness in his eyes. Your mama's not coming, little girl. You're ours now. Emma began to cry soft, hiccuping sobs that shook her small frame. The tears ran down her freckled cheeks, dripping onto her sweatshirt. Shut her up. Victor snapped from the other room. Crying kids attract attention. There's nobody out here, Kade said. But he grabbed Emma's jaw roughly, his fingers digging into her cheeks. You heard him. Quiet. But Emma couldn't stop. The fear was too big, too overwhelming. She cried for her mother, for Mr. Whiskers, for the warm kitchen and the reindeer picture she'd never finished. She cried because she was 8 years old, and she didn't understand why bad men existed, why anyone would want to hurt her. Kade's patience snapped. His hand came up fast and stopped. Victor was in the doorway, his voice cold and final. I said don't damage the merchandise. Kade lowered his hand slowly, resentment simmering in his eyes. She needs to learn. She'll learn, Victor said flatly, but not from you. Get out. Kade left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Victor looked down at Emma. She was still crying, her whole body trembling. He felt nothing, not pity, not guilt, not even disgust. She was a product, a transaction. Sentiment was a liability in this business. The more you cry, the harder this gets, he said, his voice devoid of warmth. I'd advise you to stop. He walked out and locked the door. Emma sat alone in the darkness, her wrists bound, her heart hammering in her tiny chest. She didn't understand what was happening. She didn't know words like trafficking or buyer or merchandise. All she knew was that bad men had taken her, and her mama wasn't coming. The room was so cold. She could see her breath, white clouds in the lantern, light seeping under the door. She closed her eyes and thought of home, of warmth, of safety. And in the darkness, she began to pray to anyone who might be listening. Please, she whispered to the empty room, please send someone. I'm really scared. The hours passed like years. Emma lost track of time in the windowless room. She could hear the men talking outside, their voices low and muffled. She could hear the wind picking up, howling around the cabin like a living thing. At some point, Kade brought her a bottle of water and a granola bar, shoving them at her without a word. She couldn't eat. Her throat was too tight, her stomach too knotted with fear. She thought about her mother. Was she okay? Was she looking for Emma? Was she scared too? She thought about Mr. Whiskers, who would be confused when Emma didn't come home to feed him. She thought about her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, who would notice her empty desk on Monday. But mostly, she thought about the reindeer. About Rudolph, who had been different and scared, but had found a way to save Christmas. Emma wasn't sure how a little girl with a red nose could save anything, but she held on to the thought anyway, because it was all she had. Mason knew something was wrong when Havoc refused to settle. The storm had arrived as promised, transforming the world outside the cabin into a howling beast of wind and snow. The windows rattled in their frames, and the fire in the wood stove roared as drafts fed it from a dozen invisible cracks. Mason had stoked the flames, made a simple dinner of canned chili and crackers, and settled into his chair with a worn paperback thriller. But Havoc was pacing. The dog moved from the door to the window and back again, his ears pricked forward, his body tense. His tail, usually relaxed, was held rigid. And from deep in his chest came a low, continuous whine, the sound of a dog who sensed something wrong. "What is it, boy?" Mason set the book aside, watching his partner with growing concern. Havoc barked sharp, insistent, commanding. It was his alert bark, the one he'd used in Fallujah, when he'd detected an IED buried under rubble, the one he'd used in Syria when he'd alerted to hostiles moving in the dark, the one that had saved Mason's life more times than he could count. Mason's instincts sharpened instantly. His hand went automatically to his side, where his SIG, Sauerpa 226, rested in its holster, a habit he couldn't break even on leave. Out here, miles from civilization, there should be nothing to alert on. No IEDs, no hostiles, no threats. But Havoc's instincts were never wrong. Mason stood, his relaxation evaporating like morning mist. He pulled on his boots, lacing them with practiced speed, then grabbed his heavy parka from its hook by the door. He checked his weapon, a full magazine, one in the chamber, and holstered it. He grabbed his tactical flashlight, a surefire with 000 lumens of white light, and moved to the door. "Show me," he commanded. Havoc didn't need to be told twice. The moment Mason opened the door, the dog plunged into the storm without hesitation, his nose low, tracking something Mason couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't sense. The storm hit Mason like a physical blow. The wind tore at his jacket, stealing his breath, and the snow was a blinding curtain of white that reduced visibility to less than 10 feet. The temperature had dropped to well below zero, and the cold bit through his layers with teeth of ice. But Mason had operated in worse. Helmand Province in winter, the mountains of Afghanistan, the frozen hell of Alaska during SARE training. He'd been cold before. He followed Havoc into the white chaos. The dog moved with purpose, occasionally stopping to check his scent, then pressing forward. They were moving away from the cabin, deeper into the forest. Into terrain Mason had scouted but not fully explored. The snow was knee-deep in places, deeper where it had drifted. Mason's legs burned with the effort of pushing through it. His lungs ached from breathing the frozen air. But he kept moving, his trust in Havoc absolute. 15 minutes into the storm, Havoc stopped. He stood at the edge of a shallow ravine, his body rigid, and barked down into the darkness. The sound was frantic now, desperate, the bark of a dog who has found something terrible. Mason slid down the embankment, his boots slipping on ice hidden beneath the snow. He caught himself on a pine branch, steadied, and swept his flashlight beam across the ravine floor. And then he saw it. A dog. It was a German shepherd, large and powerfully built, its coat matted with blood and ice. It lay on its side, barely breathing, its body broken. One of its back legs was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly fractured, and a dark stain spread beneath it, freezing into the snow. The dog's eyes flickered open as Mason's light hit it, pain-filled, exhausted, but still aware. Its tail gave a single, weak thump against the ground. "Jesus," Mason breathed. He dropped to his knees beside the animal, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. He'd treated wounded humans and animals in the field before. Sometimes there was no distinction, no time to choose. You saved what could be saved. The dog had been shot. A bullet had torn through its right flank, missing vital organs but leaving a devastating wound. The leg was broken, likely from a fall or impact. Hypothermia was setting in the dog's body. Temperature was dangerously low. This animal should be dead, but it wasn't. It had crawled bleeding, freezing, dying through miles of wilderness to get here. Why? Mason's eyes fell on something around the dog's neck. Not a collar, but something else, secured with duct tape, half frozen to the animal's fur. A small pink backpack. With careful fingers, Mason pulled it free. The zipper was frozen shut, but he forced it open. Inside was a child's drawing. A reindeer, half-collared, with a bright red nose, and written in crayon at the top, "Emma Hartley, age 8, Mrs. Patterson's class." Mason's blood turned to ice. He dug deeper into the backpack. A school ID card with a photo, a little girl with honey-brown curls and a gap-toothed smile. Emma Hartley, Timber Falls Elementary. Grade those. MMM. A small crumpled photograph, a woman and the same little girl, smiling in front of a Christmas tree. And at the bottom, a child's mitten, pink with white snowflakes. Mason looked at the dying shepherd, understanding flooding through him. This wasn't a lost dog. This was a nueve, a protector. and it had been trying to deliver a message. Somewhere out in that storm, a child was in danger. Havoc moved forward, pressing his nose against the German shepherd's muzzle. The dying dog looked at him, then at Mason, its eyes pleading, and then toward the forest behind them, toward something only it could sense. Mason understood. "You led me here," he said quietly to the dog. "You're telling me she's out there." The shepherd's tail thumped once more. Mason made a decision. He couldn't leave this animal to die alone, and he couldn't ignore what it was trying to tell him. He pulled off his parka and wrapped it around the shepherd, then carefully lifted the dog despite its size and weight into his arms. The animal whined softly, but didn't struggle. "Havoc," Mason commanded. "Home. Now." The two dogs and the soldier moved back through the storm, a strange procession of desperation and hope. Inside the cabin, Mason laid the German shepherd on a thick wool blanket near the fire. The dog's breathing was shallow, rattling. Time was running out. Mason moved fast, pulling his advanced field medical kit from its storage case. It was military-grade trauma shears, pressure bandages, hemostatic gauze, suture kits, morphine auto-injectors, IV supplies. He'd used these tools on humans in the worst places on Earth. Tonight, he'd use them on a dog who'd earned it. He cut away the matted fur around the gunshot wound. The bullet had gone clean through, no slug to dig out, which was good. But the wound was infected, inflamed, and still seeping blood. He irrigated it with sterile saline, packed it with hemostatic gauze to stop the bleeding, then applied pressure bandages. The broken leg was next. He couldn't set it properly without an X-ray, but he could stabilize it. He used a padded splint, securing it with medical tape, immobilizing the limb. The shepherd whined softly, its eyes flickering with pain. "I know, buddy. I know. You're doing great." Mason's voice was low, calm, the same tone he used for wounded teammates. The same tone that meant you're going to be okay, just hold on. He wrapped the dog in heated blankets from his emergency supplies, elevating its back legs slightly to improve circulation. He checked its gums pale, a sign of shock and blood loss. He started an IV line, a trick he'd learned from a combat medic in Ramadi, and began a slow drip of Ringer's lactate to stabilize the dog's blood pressure. Havoc lay nearby, watching the entire process with intense focus. When Mason finished, Havoc moved forward and gently licked the shepherd's muzzle, a gesture of comfort, of solidarity. "Good boy," Mason said, his hand finding Havoc's head. "You found him. You did good." With the dog stabilized, Mason turned his attention to the backpack. He laid out its contents on his table, like evidence at a crime scene. The drawing, the ID, the photo, the mitten. He studied the photo closely. The woman, Sarah Hartley, he assumed looked tired but kind, the kind of tired that comes from working too hard for too little. Emma looked happy, her smile genuine and bright. Mason powered up his satellite phone, one of the few pieces of gear he'd brought from his old life. It was a ruggedized iridium unit, encrypted, capable of connecting from anywhere on Earth. The signal was weak in the storm, but it connected. He dialed the Timber Falls Sheriff's Department. The number was painted on the side of the local patrol cars he'd seen during his one trip into town for supplies. The line rang 4 times before a bored, nasal voice answered. "Sheriff's Office, Deputy Krantz speaking. This is Mason Cole. I'm calling to report a possible abduction. A child named Emma Hartley." "Hold on." There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling, a keyboard clicking. Yeah. We got a welfare check request on a Sarah Hartley earlier today. One of the neighbors called, said they hadn't seen lights on. Deputies went by the house around 6. No one home, no signs of distress. House was locked up, probably stayed with family because of the storm. "I have her daughter's backpack," Mason said, his voice hard and controlled, "and a dying Knueve with a gunshot wound. This isn't a welfare check. This is an abduction." Another pause, longer this time. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but we can't launch a search in this storm based on a found backpack. Could have been dropped days ago. Could be nothing. "A dog doesn't get shot and crawl 5 miles through a blizzard for nothing," Mason said, his voice dropping to the cold, flat tone he used when patience was running out. "Look, sir, I understand you're worried." But Mason ended the call. He stared at the phone for a long moment, his jaw tight. The local authorities were useless, either incompetent, overwhelmed, or both. To a storm had cut them off. Emma Hartley, wherever she was, had maybe hours before hypothermia, or worse, claimed her. He couldn't wait for permission. He couldn't wait for protocols. He couldn't wait for a bureaucracy that moved at the speed of paperwork while a child died in the cold. He looked at Havoc, who sat at attention, waiting for orders. Then he looked at the dying shepherd, whose eyes were still open, still watching him with something that looked like hope. "You led me to her," Mason said quietly. "Now I finish what you started." He began to gear up. This wasn't leave anymore. This was a mission. Tactical pants, moisture-wicking and insulated, composite toe boots with aggressive treads, his load-bearing vest with pouches for magazines, medical supplies, water, and emergency gear, his suppressed HK 416 rifle, cleaned and loaded, his sidearm with 3 spare magazines, a combat knife on his belt, night vision monocular, thermal imaging scanner. He looked like what he was, a weapon preparing for war. He downloaded a topographical map of the area onto his ruggedized tablet. He marked his location, then began searching for likely locations where someone might hold a kidnapped child. Abandoned structures, off-grid cabins, logging access roads. There were dozens of possibilities within a 50-mile radius. But Mason had something the kidnappers didn't know about: Havoc. And Havoc had something even better: the scent. Mason held the child's mitten in front of Havoc's nose. "This is the target. Find her." Havoc inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring, processing the scent profile: sweat, detergent, something sweet like strawberry shampoo. And underneath it all, the unique chemical signature of a specific human being. He had it. "We're going hunting," Mason said. He grabbed the shepherd's backpack, secured it in his vest as evidence. He checked his weapons one last time. Then he walked to the door, threw it open, and stepped back into the storm. Behind him, on the place, blanket by the fire, Max, the dying German shepherd, watched him go. His tail thumped once against the floor. His mission was complete. He had delivered the message. Now, the warrior would finish the fight. "I'll continue this expansion to reach your target. Would you like me to complete the remaining parts now to reach the full DC 000 words? I'll continue expanding the story to reach the full DC 000 words." Mason moved through the storm like a ghost. The blizzard that would have stopped most men was merely an obstacle to him, something to work around, to use, to weaponize. He'd operated in worse conditions. The Hindu Kush, in winter, where the cold didn't just bite, it killed. The Arctic training in Alaska, where they'd taught him that the environment was just another enemy combatant. This storm was nothing. Havoc was at his side, the dog's nose low to the ground, tracking a scent that should have been impossible to follow in the blizzard. But military working dogs were bred and trained for the impossible. Their olfactory capacity was 50 times more powerful than a human's, capable of detecting individual scent molecules even hours after they'd been laid down. And Havoc was one of the best. They found the trail 3/4 of a mile from the cabin tire tracks, barely visible under 6 inches of fresh snow leading deeper into the forest. The tracks were wide set, heavy a truck or van, something with weight and power. They'd been laid down within the last few hours, before the worst of the storm hit. Mason knelt, studying them with his flashlight. 2 distinct sets the vehicle had come and gone this way, or there were 2 vehicles. He took a photo with his tactical camera, documenting everything. Havoc sniffed the tracks, then looked up at Mason, his body language clear. "This way." She went this way. They followed the tracks for 2 miles, moving through terrain that grew progressively more remote. The logging road was barely visible now, overgrown. and abandoned. The kind of place that appeared on maps but hadn't seen legitimate use in a decade. Perfect for people who didn't want to be found. The tracks led to the cache house. Mason saw it through the trees, a dark, sagging structure with boarded windows and the faint glow of interior light visible through gaps in the wood. 2 vehicles were parked outside, a dark panel van with mud-splattered sides and a pickup truck that looked like it had seen hard use. He went prone immediately, using his rifle scope to scan the building. His breath was steady, controlled, his heartbeat slow despite the adrenaline beginning to flood his system. 2 hostiles, visible inside, moving past the windows. One was lean, wiry, with the jittery movements of someone on edge or high on something. The other was larger, more controlled, professional in his bearing. The wiry one, Kade, was smoking near the front door, his rifle leaning carelessly against the porch railing. Amateur hour. No visible sign of the child. But that didn't mean she wasn't there. Mason's gut told him this was the place. Everything about it screamed wrong. The isolation, the vehicles, the men who moved like predators comfortable in their den. He pulled out his thermal imaging monocular and scanned the building. 3 heat signatures. 2 in the main room, 1 smaller, fainter, in a back room. The child. Mason's jaw tightened. She was alive. That was mission-critical information. A assessed the tactical situation with cold precision. 2 hostiles confirmed. Possibly more. Unknown weapons loadout. Hostage in a confined space. He needed to neutralize the threats without putting the child in danger. This was a hostage rescue scenario, the kind he'd trained for 1,000 times. The kind he'd executed in Mosul, in Raqqa, in a dozen other places where the bad guys thought they were safe. They were wrong then. They were wrong now. Havoc, he whispered, the command barely audible over the wind. Quiet approach. On. The dog immediately shifted into tactical mode, body low, movement silent, eyes locked on Mason for hand signals. They moved. Mason crossed the open ground in a low crouch, using the vehicles and terrain for concealment. He reached the side of the cabin and pressed himself against the wall, listening. Inside, voices. Male. Casual. Confident. Buyers delayed because of the storm. We sit tight until tomorrow night. What about the mom? That was the wiry one, Kade, his voice rough and impatient. Leave her. She'll freeze or bleed out. Either way, she's not a problem. Mason's blood turned to ice. The mother was still alive. Somewhere. That changed the mission parameters now. He had 2 potential victims to locate and extract. But first, he had to neutralize the threat. He moved to the front porch. Kade was still there, his back to the door, smoking a cigarette and staring out into the storm. His rifle, an Arkansas variant, civilian model, was 3 feet away, leaning against the railing. Mason didn't give him time to react. He moved up the steps in complete silence, his boots finding the spots that wouldn't creak, a skill learned from 100 breaches, 1,000 entries. His hand shot out, clamping over Kade's mouth from behind, his other arm wrapping around the man's throat in a blood choke. Kade tried to struggle, tried to reach for something, but Mason's grip was iron. He applied precise pressure to the carotid arteries, cutting off blood flow to the brain. Kade's eyes rolled back, his body going limp in less than 5 seconds. Mason lowered him silently to the porch, zip-tied his hands and feet with the heavy-duty restraints from his vest, and gagged him with duct tape. He grabbed Kade's rifle, ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and threw the weapon into a snowbank 20 feet away. 1 down, 0 shots fired. He tried the door. Unlocked. These guys were confident to the point of stupidity. Mason entered low and fast, his HK 416 up and ready, clearing the immediate entry in a textbook CQB sweep. The main room was exactly what he'd expected, a folding table with a camping lantern, some chairs, gear scattered around, and a closed door to the back. And standing in the center of the room, turning toward the sound of the door opening, was Victor Reese. Their eyes met across 10 feet of space. Victor was faster than Kade, his hand moving toward the pistol holstered at his hip with the practiced speed of someone who'd been in fights before. But Mason was faster. He had his sights on Victor before the man's hand even touched his weapon. "Don't," Mason said, his voice low and absolutely devoid of emotion. It was the voice of someone who had killed before and would do it again without hesitation. Victor froze. His hand hovered near his weapon, his eyes calculating odds, measuring angles. "Hands, slowly," Mason commanded. Victor's hands came up, but his eyes never left Mason's. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice controlled, almost reasonable. "You don't know what you're walking into." "I know exactly what I'm walking into. Where's the girl?" Victor's expression didn't change. "What girl?" Mason shifted his aim slightly and fired. The suppressed rifle covered a controlled burst, both rounds hitting the wall inches from Victor's head. Splinters exploded, and Victor flinched. "Next one's through your knee. Where is the girl?" Victor's mask cracked. Fear flickered across his face. Real, genuine fear. "Back room. She's alive. She's fine. Don't shoot. On your knees. Hands behind your head." Victor complied slowly, his movements careful. Mason moved forward, kicked the pistol away from Victor's reach, and drove the man face first to the floor. He secured Victor's wrists with zip ties, the plastic biting deep into flesh. "How many others?" Victor sipped. "Just us. Just me and Kade." Mason didn't believe him, but he didn't have time to interrogate. He moved to the back room and kicked the door open, his rifle up, ready for anything. Emma was huddled in the corner of the small, cold room, her small body trembling violently. Her wrists were still zip-tied to the radiator pipe. Her purple sweatshirt was dirty, her face was streaked with tears, and her wide hazel eyes were filled with a terror so profound it hurt to look at. When the door burst open, she flinched, pressing herself harder against the wall, a small whimper escaping her throat. Mason immediately lowered his rifle, his entire demeanor shifting in an instant from operator to protector. His voice, which moments ago had been cold and lethal, softened. "Emma," he said gently, kneeling slowly in front of her. "My name is Mason. I'm here to help you. You're safe now." Emma stared at him, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She didn't move. She'd learned in the last hours that men were dangerous, that trust was a lie. Mason understood. He'd seen this before, in villages, in Iraq, in compounds in Afghanistan. The look of someone who'd been broken by fear. He slowly reached into his vest and pulled out the crumpled photograph, the one of Emma and her mother, in front of the Christmas tree. "Your dog brought this to me," he said softly, holding it up so she could see. "A big German shepherd. I think his name is Max." Emma's eyes widened. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Max," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He tried to stop them. They shot him." Mason's chest tightened. "He's hurt, but he's alive. He's at my cabin right now, wrapped in warm blankets by a fire. He led me to you, Emma. He's a hero, just like you." Emma blinked, trying to process this information. He's alive?" "He is, and he's waiting for you." Mason pulled out his knife, and Emma flinched hard, her body going rigid. "Easy," Mason said immediately, his voice calm and steady. "I'm just going to cut the zip ties. I'm not going to hurt you. I promise." He moved slowly, deliberately, letting her see every movement. He slid the blade under the plastic restraints and sliced through them with a quick motion. The ties fell away. Emma immediately pulled her hands close to her chest, rubbing the raw, red marks on her wrists. Her fingers were cold, nearly blue. "Where's my mama?" Her voice was so small, so fragile, it could break. "We're going to find her," Mason promised, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "But first, I need to get you warm and safe. Can you walk?" Emma nodded slowly. Mason pulled off his tactical vest. It was heavy, loaded with gear and ammunition, and draped it over her shoulders like a blanket. It was huge on her small frame, hanging down to her knees, but it was warm, and it smelled like safety gun oil and canvas and something solid. He lifted her into his arms, and she didn't resist. She wrapped her small arms around his neck, pressing her face against his shoulder, and began to cry, not the silent, terrified tears from before, but the deep, racking sobs of someone who'd been holding on by a thread and finally felt safe enough to let go. "You're okay," Mason murmured, his voice low and steady. "I've got you. You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you again." Havoc appeared in the doorway, his tail wagging slowly, his expression, if a dog could have expressions, gentle and reassuring. Emma lifted her head slightly, her tear-stained face looking at the dog. "Is that your dog?" "His name is Havoc," Mason said. "He's a good boy, just like Max." Emma reached out with one small hand, and Havoc moved forward, pressing his nose gently against her palm. His tail wagged faster. For the first time since the nightmare began, Emma felt something other than terror. She felt safe. Mason carried her out of the room, past Victor, who lay zip-tied on the floor, his face pressed against dirty linoleum. Victor looked up as they passed, his eyes meeting Emma's for just a moment. Emma buried her face in Mason's shoulder, refusing to look at him. Outside, the storm was still raging, but it felt different now. It felt like freedom. Mason carried Emma outside, shielding her from the storm with his body. The wind tore at them, and the snow fell in thick curtains, but Emma was wrapped in his vest, protected. Havoc moved ahead, scouting the path, his body low and alert. But as they reached the tree line, Mason stopped. He looked down at Emma, who was clinging to him with desperate strength. "Emma, I need you to be very brave and tell me something. Where is your mother? Where do you live?" Emma's voice was muffled against his shoulder. 34, Pinewood Lane, in Timber Falls. They hurt her. She was on the floor. She wasn't moving." Mason's jaw tightened. He pulled out his sat phone, sheltering it from the snow, and dialed the sheriff's department again. A different voice answered this time. "Sheriff's Department, Sheriff Briggs. This is Mason Cole. I've recovered Emma Hartley. She was abducted by two men, Victor Reese and an accomplice, named Kade. Reese is secured at an abandoned logging cabin at these coordinates." He rattled off the GPS location. "The mother, Sarah Hartley, is injured at 34 Pinewood Lane. She needs immediate medical attention." There was a pause, the sound of a man snapping into action. "Say again, you've recovered the child?" "Affirmative. Emma Hartley, 8 years old, alive and conscious. The suspects are neutralized and restrained. I'm extracting her now. Send EMS to Pinewood Lane immediately." "Copy that. We're rolling now. What's your 20? "I'll meet your units at my location in 30 minutes. Cabin off. Forest Service Road, 447. Mile marker 23. You can't miss it." He ended the call and looked down at Emma. "Your mama's going to be okay. Help is coming. Promise?" Emma whispered. "Promise." Mason moved through the storm with Emma in his arms, Havoc leading the way. The journey back to the cabin took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of brutal cold and wind, but Emma stayed warm, wrapped in his vest, her small body pressed against his chest. When they finally reached the cabin, Mason kicked the door open and carried Emma inside. The warmth hit them immediately, and Emma made a small sound of relief. Mason laid her on the couch near the fire, wrapping her in thick wool blankets. He checked her for injuries, bruises on her wrists, some scrapes on her knees, but nothing life-threatening. She was in shock, cold, and terrified, but she was alive. And then Emma saw Max. The German Shepherd was still lying by the fire, his breathing steadier now, his eyes half open. The IV line Mason had placed was still running, and his wounds were bandaged. Max. Emma's voice was a cry of joy and heartbreak. She tried to get up, but Mason steadied her. "Slow, slow. He's hurt pretty badly, but he's stable. You can see him." Emma crawled off the couch, her legs shaky, and dropped to her knees beside Max. She wrapped her small arms gently around his neck, careful not to hurt him, and buried her face in his fur. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're my hero. You're the best dog in the whole world." Max's tail thumped weakly against the floor. His eyes opened fully, looking at Emma, and in that moment, the pain seemed to fade from his expression. His mission was complete. The child he'd set out to save was safe. Mason watched the reunion, his throat tight. This dog-shot, broken, freezing had crawled through miles of wilderness to find help. That was loyalty. That was love. That was courage more pure than anything he'd seen on 100 battlefields. Havoc approached slowly, lying down next to Max, his head resting near the older dog's. Two warriors, two protectors, united in purpose. Mason pulled out his phone and took a photo, Emma hugging Max, Havoc beside them, the fire glowing in the background. He didn't know why. Ade just knew this moment mattered. 20 minutes later, he heard the sound of vehicles approaching. He looked out the window and saw the flashing lights of Sheriff's Department SUVs cutting through the storm. "They're here," he said to Emma. "The good guys." Emma looked up at him, her eyes still filled with tears, but no longer with fear. "Are you a good guy?" Mason knelt beside her. "I try to be." "You are," Emma said with absolute certainty. "You're a hero, just like Max." Mason shook his head. "Max is the hero. I just finished his mission." Sheriff Tom Briggs was the first through the door. He was a man in his late 50s, with steel-gray hair, sharp blue eyes, and the weathered face of someone who'd spent 30 years enforcing law in a place where the wilderness was as much of a threat as the criminals. He wore a heavy winter coat over his uniform and moved with the deliberate confidence of someone who knew his job and did it well. Behind him came two deputies and a pair of EMTs carrying medical gear. "Mason Cole?" Briggs asked, his eyes scanning the cabin, taking in the scene the child wrapped in. Blankets, the wounded dog by the fire, the military precision of the setup. "That's me." Briggs nodded. "Where's the girl?" "Right here." Mason stepped aside, gesturing to Emma. One of the EMTs, a woman in her 40s named Chen, immediately moved to Emma's side. "Hi, sweetheart. My name's Maria. I'm going to check you over, okay? Make sure you're not hurt." Emma looked at Mason, uncertain. "It's okay," Mason said gently. "She's here to help." Emma nodded and let the EMT examine her. Chen was thorough but gentle, checking vitals, looking for injuries, speaking in a calm, reassuring voice. The other EMT, a younger man, approached Max. "This the dog?" "Gunshot wound to the flank, broken leg, severe hypothermia," Mason reported, his tone clinical. "I've stabilized him with pressure bandages, splint, and IV fluids. He needs a vet, but he should make transport." The EMT stared at Mason, then at the professional field dressing on the dog. "You did this?" "I did." "You military?" "Navy. SEAL." The EMT nodded slowly, respect clear in his expression. "Well, you probably saved his life." Briggs pulled Mason aside, his voice low. "Tell me what happened." "Everything." Mason gave him the full brief, finding Max with the backpack, tracking the suspects to the cash house, the tactical breach, securing Emma. He kept it concise, factual, leaving out nothing. When he finished, Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You saved that little girl's life. You know that, right?" "Max saved her. I just did the extraction." Briggs studied him. "You're being humble. That's admirable. But what you did tonight, most men couldn't do that. Wouldn't do that." "I'm not most men." "No," Briggs agreed. "You're not." He pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, this is Briggs. Send units to the coordinates Cole provided. Suspects are secured on site. Also send EMS to 34 Pinewood Lane immediately. We have an injured victim." The radio crackled. "Copy, Sheriff. Units rolling." Briggs turned back to Mason. "The mother?" "The suspects said they left her tied up at the house. She was beaten." I don't know her condition. Briggs' expression darkened. These guys are going away for a long time. They'd better, Mason said, his voice carrying a cold edge. An hour later, word came over the radio. Sarah Hartley had been found, alive. She'd been beaten badly, fractured ribs, a concussion, severe bruising, but she would survive. She was being transported to County General Hospital. Emma, who'd been dozing on the couch, woke when she heard the news. My mama's okay? She's okay, Mason confirmed. She's at the hospital. They're taking care of her. Emma began to cry again, but this time they were tears of relief. Over the next several days, as the storm finally broke and the roads cleared, the full scope of Victor Reese's operation came to light. It was worse than anyone had imagined. FBI agents arrived from the regional office in Billings. They tore apart the cache house, the vehicles, and Reese's digital footprint. What they found painted a picture of an operation that had been running for at least 3 years. Reese wasn't just a two-bit kidnapper. He was part of a regional trafficking network that moved children across state lines, selling them to buyers across the country and internationally. He had contacts, truck drivers who moved packages, corrupt officials who looked the other way, handlers in 6 different states. Emma would have been victim number 47. But Reese's laptop, recovered from the cache house, contained everything. Encrypted communications with buyers, financial records showing over $2 million in transactions, and a list of 17 co-conspirators. The FBI arrested them all within a week. But there was one name on the list that sent shockwaves through the Timber Falls community. Deputy Marcus Holden, a 15-year veteran of the Sheriff's Department. Holden had been providing Reese with information patrol, schedules, welfare check requests, active investigations. He'd been the one who'd told Reese that Sarah Hartley lived alone with her daughter, that she had no family nearby, that she'd be an easy target. He'd been paid $5,000 for the information. Sheriff Briggs personally arrested him, and the look on his face when he did it was something the other deputies would talk about for years. 30 years. Briggs said later, sitting in the hospital cafeteria with Mason. 30 years I've been a cop. You think you know your people. You think you can trust them. Trust is earned, Mason said. Not given. You learned that in the teams? I learned it everywhere. Mason stayed in Timber Falls as the investigation unfolded. He'd planned to return to base, to finish his leave somewhere quieter, but something kept him there. Maybe it was Emma, who asked about him every day. Maybe it was Sarah, who'd thanked him with tears streaming down her bruised face. Maybe it was Max, who was recovering at the local veterinary clinic and needed someone to check on him. Or maybe it was just the knowledge that the job wasn't finished. He visited Emma and Sarah at the hospital every day, always bringing havoc with him. The hospital had bent their rules about animals in patient rooms when they learned what Havoc was, a military working dog, a hero in his own right. Emma's face would light up every time Mason walked through the door. She'd run to Havoc first, throwing her arms around the dog's neck, then turn to Mason with a smile that was slowly, day by day, returning to the carefree expression of childhood. "Can we visit Max today?" she'd ask. Absolutely. The vet clinic became part of their daily routine. Dr. Ellen Foster, the veterinarian who'd taken over Max's care, was a woman in her 60s who'd seen everything in 40 years of practice, but even she was amazed by Max's recovery. "He should be dead," she said bluntly. "The blood loss alone should have killed him. The hypothermia should have killed him. The shock, the trauma, any one of these things should have killed him. But he's alive. He's healing. It's a miracle." Mason looked at Max, who was lying in a large recovery kennel, his leg in a cast, his side bandaged, but his eyes bright and his tail wagging when he saw Emma approach. "He had a mission," Mason said. "He wasn't going to die until it was complete." Dr. Foster nodded slowly. "I believe that." Emma was allowed into Max's kennel, where she sat beside him, reading him stories from a book the hospital social worker had brought her. Max listened, his head resting on her lap, his eyes half closed in contentment. "He's my guardian angel," Emma told Mason one day. That's what Mama says. God sent him to save me." Mason, who'd seen too much death to believe in easy answers about God and angels, found himself nodding. Maybe he did. There was one loose end: Carson Vega. The FBI had identified him as the buyer, the man who'd been scheduled to pick up Emma and transport her out of the country. He was a wealthy businessman from Seattle, owner of a tech startup, philanthropist, donor to children's charities. And a monster. The FBI tracked him to a private airfield outside Missoula, where he was preparing to leave the country. He'd heard about the arrests, heard that his network was collapsing, and was running. The FBI's hostage rescue team was mobilized. Mason wasn't officially part of the operation. He was a sailor, not a federal agent, and he was still, technically, on leave. But Sheriff Briggs, who developed a deep respect for Mason, made a call to the FBI special agent in charge. "You've got a Navy SEAL here who knows this case inside and out. He's the one who broke it open. You should bring him." The SAC, a hard-nosed woman named Rachel Torres, agreed. Mason rode in the second helicopter, wearing a borrowed FBI raid jacket over his civilian clothes, his HK 416 replaced with a loaned FBI HBK MP5. He wasn't officially there, but he was there. The raid on the airfield was swift and overwhelming. 3 helicopters, 2 ground teams, total surprise. Vega was arrested without a shot fired as he was boarding his private jet. He was wearing expensive clothes, carrying a leather briefcase, and looked like exactly what he was: a wealthy man accustomed to getting what he wanted, until he couldn't. As federal agents led him away in handcuffs, Vega's eyes swept the assembled law enforcement. They landed on Mason, who stood slightly apart from the FBI agents, his expression cold and unreadable. Vega sneered. "Who are you supposed to be? Another Fed?" Mason said nothing. He just stared, his gray eyes holding Vega's gaze with an intensity that made the businessman flinch. "You got lucky," Vega spat. "You think you've won? There are a dozen more like me." "This doesn't end." Mason finally spoke, his voice low and absolutely devoid of emotion. "It ended for Emma. That's all that matters." Vega was shoved into a waiting SUV, the door slamming shut. SAC Torres walked over to Mason. "Thank you for your assistance. I didn't do anything," Mason said. "Max did. Emma did. They're the heroes." Torres smiled slightly. "You military types always say that. Because it's true." As the helicopters lifted off, carrying the raiders back to civilization, Mason looked out the window at the Montana wilderness below, vast, unforgiving, beautiful. Somewhere down there, a little girl was safe. A mother was healing. A dog was recovering. That was all the justice he needed. 3 months later, the Flathead County Courthouse in Kalispell, Montana, was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled, and overflow spectators stood in the hallway, watching through the doors. Victor Reese, Kade Morrison, and Carson Vega sat at separate defense tables, each flanked by attorneys. They no longer looked confident. They looked like what they were: predators who'd been caught, caged, and were about to be put away forever. The federal charges were devastating: kidnapping, human trafficking, conspiracy, transportation of minors across state lines for illegal purposes, attempted murder. The state added its own charges: assault, child endangerment, and in Vega's case, because of evidence found on his devices, multiple counts of child exploitation. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. The guilty verdicts came back in less than 4 hours. Victor Reese, life in federal prison without possibility of parole. Kade Morrison, 45 years. Carson Vega, 3 consecutive life sentences. The 17 co-conspirators arrested as part of the wider network faced similar fates. The trafficking ring that had operated with impunity for years was dismantled completely. When the verdict was read, Sarah Hartley, sitting in the front row with Emma beside her, closed her eyes and wept. Not tears of sadness, but tears of release. The nightmare was over. Emma held her mother's hand tightly, and looked across the courtroom to where Mason sat in the back row, Havoc lying quietly at his feet. She smiled at him. He nodded back. The civil settlement came later. The state of Montana, facing a lawsuit over Deputy Holden's involvement, agreed to a substantial victims' compensation fund. Sarah was awarded $850 enough to move her, and Emma to a safer town, to start over, to rebuild. She used part of it to buy a small house in Whitefish, a town 50 miles north of Timber Falls. It had 3 bedrooms, a fenced yard, and windows that let in so much light it felt like a different world from the drafty rental on Pinewood Lane. Emma got her own room. She decorated it with drawings, hundreds of them. Pictures of reindeer, of dogs, of mountains, of a man with a dog who'd saved her life. Sarah returned to school, enrolling in a nursing program at the community college. She wanted to help people, to turn her pain into purpose. And Emma? Emma began to heal. She still had nightmares. She still woke up sometimes in the middle of the night, convinced she was back in the cold room. But Sarah was always there, and so was Max, because Max had come home. Dr. Foster had called it a miracle when Max was finally cleared to leave the clinic. His leg had healed, though he walked with a slight limp now. His gunshot wound had closed, leaving a scar hidden beneath fur. He would never work as a knuvi again. His body had been through too much. But he didn't need to work. He had a new job, protecting Emma. Old Man Garrett, Max's original owner, had visited the dog in the hospital and made a decision. "He doesn't belong to me anymore," the old man said, his voice thick with emotion. "He belongs to her. He chose her. A dog like that, you don't argue with his choice." So Max became Emma's dog, officially and permanently. She walked him every morning before school, did her homework with him lying beside her, and fell asleep every night with his warm, solid presence at the foot of her. He was her guardian angel, her protector, her hero. On Mason's last day in Montana before returning to active duty, the town of Timber Falls threw a ceremony. It was held in the high school gymnasium because no other building was large enough to hold everyone who wanted to attend. The entire town seemed to be, their teachers, shopkeepers, ranchers, kids, everyone. Mason hated every second of it. He stood on a small stage, uncomfortable in his navy dress uniform, while the mayor, a cheerful woman named Linda Chen, gave a speech about heroism and courage and the American spirit. "This man," she said, gesturing to Mason, "didn't hesitate when he heard a call for help. He didn't wait for permission or backup. He acted. And because he acted, Emma Hartley is alive. Sarah Hartley is alive. And a monster is behind bars." The gymnasium erupted in applause. Mason stood stiffly, his face expressionless. Havoc sat beside him, also looking uncomfortable with the attention. They presented him with a plaque, a wooden thing, with an engraved brass plate that read, "Mason Cole, Navy SEAL, Hero, Protector, Friend." They presented him with a key to the city, a symbolic gesture that meant nothing but everything. And then Sarah and Emma walked onto the stage. Sarah had tears streaming down her face. She walked up to Mason and hugged him fierce, and desperate and grateful. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving me my daughter back." Mason, who was used to hard things, bullets and explosions, and death, found this simple gratitude almost unbearable. "I'm glad I could help," he said, his voice rough. Emma stepped forward. She was wearing a yellow dress and had a flower in her hair. She looked healthy, happy, alive. She held out a folded piece of paper. "I made this for you," she said. Mason took it and carefully unfolded it. It was a drawing done in crayon, with the careful detail of a child who'd spent hours on it. It showed a man and 2 dogs standing on a mountain. The man was tall and strong. One dog was tan and fierce, the other was dark with a bandaged side. And standing next to them, holding the man's hand, was a little girl. At the bottom, in careful letters, Emma had written, "My heroes." Mason stared at the drawing for a long moment. He folded it carefully and put it in his uniform pocket, right over his heart. "Thank you, Emma." said quietly. "I'll keep this forever." Emma threw her arms around his waist, hugging him tight. The gymnasium erupted in applause again, but Mason barely heard it. He was looking down at this little girl, this survivor, and thinking about how close they'd come to losing her. When the ceremony finally ended, Mason and Havoc slipped out the back door. They walked to the parking lot where his truck was waiting. But someone was there. Max. The German Shepherd was sitting beside the truck, his tail wagging slowly. Emma had brought him, holding his leash. "I wanted Max to say goodbye," Emma said. Mason knelt, bringing himself to eye level with the dog. He reached out, running his hand over Max's scarred head. "You did good, soldier," Mason said quietly. "You saved her. You completed the mission. Stand down. You've earned your rest." Max leaned forward and licked Mason's face, a rare gesture from a working dog, a sign of respect and recognition. Havoc approached, and the two dogs touched noses one final time. Warriors, brothers, protectors. Mason stood, looked at Emma and Sarah one last time. "Take care of each other," he said. "We will," Sarah promised. "And Emma?" "Yes?" "You're braver than most soldiers I know. Don't ever forget that." Emma smiled that bright, gap-toothed smile that had survived hell and come out the other side. Mason climbed into his truck, Havoc jumping in beside him. He started the engine, gave a final wave, and drove away. In the rearview mirror, he watched Emma and Max grow smaller, two figures standing together in the Montana sunshine. Safe, alive, free, that was all that mattered. Heroes walk among us. They don't wear capes or seek glory or demand recognition. They are the ones who hear the call when no one else is listening, who run toward danger when everyone else runs away, who refuse to let evil win simply because someone has to stand against it. Mason Cole was one of those heroes. So was Havoc. So was Max, the old German shepherd who crawled through a blizzard to deliver a message of hope. But the real hero of this story, the one who deserves to be remembered, is Emma Hartley. She's a little girl who survived the unthinkable, who endured terror that would break most adults, who never gave up hope, even when hope seemed impossible. She's 8 years old, and she's braver than most people will ever be in their entire lives. This story reminds us of truths we sometimes forget in the noise and chaos of modern life. First, loyalty is the strongest force on earth. Max didn't stop to calculate odds or consider his own safety. He saw someone he loved in danger, and he acted. He fought, he ran. He crawled through hell to deliver hope. That is the bond between protector and protected. That is love in its purest form. Second, one person can make a difference. Mason didn't wait for permission from bureaucracies or approvals from committees. He saw a child in danger, and he moved. He acted with skill and courage and refused to accept defeat. Because he acted, a little girl is alive today. One person, one decision, one mission. That changed everything. Third, evil is real, but so is good. For every predator lurking in the darkness, there is a warrior standing watch. For every Victor Reese who sees children as merchandise, there is a Mason Cole who sees them as lives worth dying for. The battle between good and evil is not an abstract philosophical debate. It's real, it's ongoing, and it happens every single day in places most of us will never see. Fourth, animals are not just pets. They are protectors, companions, and heroes. Max gave everything to save Emma. He was shot, broken, freezing, and dying, but he didn't stop. He completed his mission because that's what working dogs do. They serve, they protect, they love without condition or reservation. Fifth, the storm will always break. Emma's nightmare lasted hours that felt like years. Sarah's terror was absolute. But the storm broke. The dawn came. Help arrived. Justice was served. No matter how dark the night, no matter how hopeless the situation, there is always the possibility of rescue, of redemption, of dawn. If this story has touched your heart, I want you to remember something important. You have the power to be someone's hero. You may not have Mason's training, or Havoc's instincts, or Max's courage. But you have your eyes, your voice, your willingness to act when others won't. Keep your eyes open. Pay attention to the world around you. That neighbor who's too quiet. That child who seems afraid. That situation that doesn't feel right. Listen for the call. It might not come as a dying dog in a snowstorm. It might come as a whisper, a feeling, a moment where you know something is wrong. And when you hear it, don't look away. Speak up. Make the call. Be the person who acts. Because somewhere, right now, someone is waiting for you to be their Mason Cole. Someone is praying for a hero to find them. Someone needs you to hear their silent scream. Be that person. Be the one who runs toward danger instead of away from it. Be the one who refuses to let evil win. Be the warrior standing watch in the darkness. Because heroes don't wait for permission. They don't wait for perfect conditions or complete information. Heroes just act. And in that action, they save lives. Emma Hartley is alive today because one old dog refused to give up. Because one soldier refused to ignore a call for help. Because one Belgian Malinois trusted his handler's instincts. 3 lives, 1 human, 2 canine united in purpose, created a miracle. What miracle are you capable of? What child is waiting for you to hear their cry? What evil will you refuse to tolerate? The answer to those questions might just save a life. So keep watching, keep listening, keep standing ready, because the world needs heroes. And maybe, just maybe, that hero is you. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that heroes still exist. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments. What was your favorite moment? Was it Max's incredible journey through the blizzard, Mason's tactical rescue, Havoc's unwavering loyalty, or the moment Emma was finally safe? We read every comment. God bless, and see you in the next story.